Welcome to our Zoom lessons on the story of Jesus. My name is Jamie Knapp, and in this lesson, we will focus on death and burial. Let's share the screen so we can get to the PowerPoint slides. Before being crucified, a condemned man was scourged, sometimes known as being flogged. Jesus experienced this. Matthew 27 tells us that, Mark 15, John 19. Scourging was done with a device known as a flagrum. A flagrum was a short whip that had a handle, and typically it had 2 to 3 leather tongs extending from the handle. Now, some pictures you might see of a flagrum will show more than 2 or 3 thongs, but typically there were 2 or 3 leather tongs extending from the handle. Those tongs would have been knotted, and they would have had sharp pieces of stone and metal attached for sure at the end of each tong, but in some cases even along the way toward the end of each tong. The condemned man was forced to stoop over, which arched his back, and then the blows were delivered by individuals who were known as lictors. Sometimes there was just one lictor, but often there were two, one on either side of the condemned man. And the lictors would rake the flagrum across the back of the man with quick, very deliberate motions. And it didn't take very long before there were deep lacerations. The flesh was mangled. There was excessive bleeding. The muscles would be exposed. And there was not a limit on how many lashes could be given. Scholars tell us that there were some condemned men who never made it to their crucifixion. They died during the scourging process. Now, in charge of all of this was a centurion, a Roman unit within the army known as a centuria, had about 80 to 100 men within it. And the person who was in charge of that centuria was known as a centurion. And so a centurion would have been given the responsibility of overseeing the scourging. And it was his job to find that delicate balance between scourging the man to the point that he was nearly dead, but not letting the man actually die. After being scourged, the condemned man was then forced to carry the horizontal crossbeam of his cross to the place of his execution. Jesus experienced this, but the Roman soldiers added an extra step in the process for him. Following his scourging, Jesus was forced to wear a scarlet robe, a crown of thorns, and to hold a reed in his hand. We're told this in Matthew chapter 27, Mark 15, and John 19. And the Roman soldiers just had a big old time. They mocked Jesus, they hit him, they spit on him, they asked him to prophesy to him. And once they had their fun, then they took the robe off of Jesus, they put the crossbeam on his back, and they began the walk to the execution site. Jesus was so weakened by the scourging, and this actually happened fairly often, that someone had to be pulled out of the crowd to actually carry the crossbeam. In Jesus' case, the man pulled out of the crowd is identified in Matthew 27, Mark 15, and Luke 23. He was a man whose name was Simon or Simone of Cyrene. Cyrene was, still is a location in North Africa. Crucifixions took place outside of the walls that surrounded Jerusalem, and more specifically, it would have been to the northwest of Jerusalem where the executions took place. The place was a hill. Now, keep in mind that the person who'd been scourged, who was then expected to carry the crossbeam of his cross, was also expected to walk up a hill to the place of execution. That's another reason why it was so difficult for someone to actually make it all the way to up this hill with the crossbeam on their back. Now, some have suggested this wasn't a hill as much as it was a knoll being a kind of a shorter, rounded off type of hill. But regardless of whether we call it a hill or a knoll, it was agreed upon that this place looked like a skull, and that's why it was called Golgotha. In the Greek language, that means the place of the skull. It's interesting to note that in the Aramaic language, there's a very similar looking word, also meaning skull. In the Hebrew language, there's a similar looking word that also means skull. So there was almost a unanimous agreement that this place looked like a skull, and it was referred to as the place of the skull. Now, you might be wondering at this point, then how do we come up with the idea of Mount Calvary and the expression Mount Calvary? We sing songs that make reference to Calvary, lead me to Calvary, and I believe in a hill called Mount Calvary. Well, the Latin word, which means the uppermost part of the skull, is Calvaria. And you can see it's a pretty simple step to go from Calvaria to Calvary. And scholars and historians have told us that by around the 6th century AD, there was growing acceptance for the idea of referring to Golgotha using the Latin word Calvaria, and thus it became known as Mount Calvary. When Jesus' crucifixion occurred around 9 o'clock in the morning, the way Jewish people kept track of time during the day was from sun up to sundown, from sunrise to sunset. And generally that was around 6 a.m. for sunrise, 6 p.m. for sunset. Of course, the time of the year impacted that a little bit. And so when you read in your Bible that the crucifixion of Jesus happened at the 3rd hour, well, that means approximately 9 a.m. At noon, which would have been the 6th hour, darkness fell over the land until 3 p.m., the 9th hour, which is when Jesus died. We're told that in Matthew 27, Mark 15, and Luke 23. During the 6 hours between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m., interaction occurred. Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell us that religious leaders, soldiers, and generally just people passing by hurled insults at Jesus about being the Messiah and saving himself and coming down off the cross. We're also told in Luke 23, verses 39 through 43, about the penitent thief. 2 criminals were executed on either side of Jesus. One of those criminals kind of mocked Jesus and said, "Why don't you get us down from here? Save yourself, save us." The criminal on the other side, or the thief on the other side, said that Jesus was an innocent man, that both of them, the criminals, deserved the beater, but Jesus did not. And then he asked Jesus to remember him when he came in his kingdom. John 19 also includes some information where Jesus looks at his mother and he looks at John and he says, "Woman, behold your son." And then he says to John, "Behold your mother." And he's saying basically, from now on, John, I would like for you to take care of my mother. Now, this is interesting because what it suggests is that a cross really wasn't that tall. Let me get out of this and let's share a picture which might be helpful to us. And I apologize for the wording over here and the highlighting, some of the wording down here. But this is an artist rendition of what a Roman cross would look like. This representing the ground, of course, and then the feet, the body of the individual. And while we generally might think that a cross was 6 feet in the air, 8 feet in the air, 10 feet in the air, scholars tell us that a Roman cross was usually just a few feet off the ground. And so it would have been very possible for Jesus to have said something that his mother could hear, to have said something that that John could have heard. Scholars tell us that it was not unusual for an individual having already been nailed to the cross to actually give instructions, in essence, their last will and testament to someone who would write it down to carry out the individual's wishes once they were dead. And so people were close enough that they could have reached out and certainly touched the feet of an individual who was on the cross, maybe even touched their shins or their knees. And so the idea that the person who was crucified was way up in the air and people had to crane their neck to look at it is probably not the case. We can also notice a couple of things in this artist's rendition. First of all, the individual would have been tied to the cross and nailed, and the nails would not have gone through their palm as we might think, but they would have probably been driven through the wrist, just below where the hand begins to connect to the arm. You'll notice that the legs of the crucified individual would have been folded either to the right or to the left, and then the feet would have been nailed here. And you might also be able to notice a little board here. This would not have been a seat per se, but it was enough of a board that as a person would pull themselves up in order to breathe, they could at least temporarily sort of rest on this board before the forces of gravity just kind of pulled their body down toward the ground. And then they would begin the process again of pushing themselves up to take in some air, perhaps temporarily stopping on this board, but then their body slipping down. And so that process would just go on and on. All right, let's get out of this and get back to the PowerPoint. So Jesus died at approximately 3 p.m., the ninth hour. And at this point, the religious leaders had what they wanted. They wanted Jesus dead, and he was dead. The next thing they wanted was they didn't want bodies being left on the cross because the Sabbath day was Saturday, and this was also the Passover. And so the religious leaders went to Pilate and they said, would you have the legs of the condemned men broken to hasten their death? And he agreed to do that, John chapter 19, verses 31 through 33. Once the legs were broken, the individuals could no longer use their legs to push themselves up in order to breathe, and that would hasten the process of death. When they came to Jesus, he was already dead. And so rather than break his legs, he was pierced in his side with a spear, John 19, verse 34. Well, when you execute the number of people that the Romans did, you also had the issue of dealing with all of the bodies. And scholars tell us that the Romans did have what we might call a pauper cemetery located near Golgotha. And if no one came to claim the body of someone who had died on a cross, well, then the body was taken to the pauper's cemetery. In the case of Jesus, there was a man whose name was Joseph. He was from a place called Arimathea. He was a wealthy individual. He was a member of the Sanhedrin, sometimes called the Sanhedrin. It's sometimes also called the council. And the Sanhedrin was, in essence, the supreme court of the Jewish people at that time. Joseph of Arimathea was also a believer in Jesus. He was not a real public believer in Jesus, but he was a believer in Jesus. And so he asked Pilate if he could have Jesus' body. And from the perspective of Pilate, that was just one less body that they had to deal with. And so he agreed to give the body to Joseph. It was late in the day when this happened. And so Joseph of Arimathea wrapped Jesus' body in the linen cloth, and he placed it in a freshly cut tomb, and he rolled a stone in front of it. We're told that in Matthew 27, Mark 15, and Luke 23. John chapter 19 gives us a few more details that are quite interesting to notice. Nicodemus, who had come to Jesus much, much earlier in his ministry and asked about being born again, Nicodemus actually helped Joseph move the body, and Nicodemus had brought nearly 100 pounds of spices, myrrh and aloes, and they were going to be used as a part of preparing Jesus' body for his burial. We're also told in John chapter 19 that the tomb was located near Golgotha. Now, before we bring this lesson to a close, I'd like for us to look at one more picture. This is an artist's rendition of what a tomb would have looked like. And archaeologists, excuse me, have discovered more than 900 tombs in that area from this period of time. And so they feel quite confident that this is what a tomb typically looked like. And let's start from the outside. We'll work our way in. This would be outside of the cave, basically, that had been carved out. And you see here the rolling stone, about 4 feet across. There was an incline. And when the stone was covering the entrance, it would have said here at the bottom of the incline. When you wanted to go into the tomb, the stone had to be rolled uphill, and then a stopping stone was placed there so the stone didn't roll back across. The entrance itself was about 2 feet wide and about 3 feet high. So what would happen is the stone would be moved, the stopping stone placed there, and the body, in this case, Joseph and Nicodemus, would have carried Jesus' body inside of the tomb and then placed it on one of the benches. A bench would have been here, here, or in this case, here. And it was on the bench that the body would have actually been prepared for burial, either with a cloth, a whole cloth, or with strips of linen. And that's when the myrrh and the aloe that Nicodemus had brought would have been placed at various points on Jesus' body, and the body would have been wrapped. Once that preparation was complete, then the body would be placed into one of these slots, which were K-O-K-H, pronounced Coke. Now, this one happens to be open, so you can see what it looks like, but imagine that there would also be a wall there. And so these were basically just the 2 foot wide shelves, basically. And in this particular rendition, there were actually several, approximately 10. So what would happen is the body would be placed inside of one of these cokes, and then a stone would be placed in front of the entrance, and that would seal the coke. And over a span of time, the body would then decompose. Once the body had fully decomposed and it was nothing but bones, someone would come back and they would take the stone off and they would pull the bones out and they would put them into a box, a stone box known as an ossuary. And then that ossuary would be taken somewhere else. And by doing that, the coke would then be available for another body. And so it's not as if a tomb necessarily filled up to where there was no room left unless too many people died in too close of a proximity to one another. Over time, each of these cokes could be used again. Now, in the case of Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, by the time they got Jesus' body off the cross, by the time they got it over to the tomb, by the time they got it prepared, it would have been late. It may have been dark or getting very close to dark. It also would be bumping up against the start of Sabbath. The Sabbath began at 6 p.m. on Friday and extended to 6 p.m. on Saturday. And so Jesus' body would have been left on one of these benches. And then Joseph and Nicodemus would have come out. They would have removed the stopping stone. They would have rolled the stone back in front of the door. And their plan would have been to come back on Sunday after the Sabbath and complete the process. And completing the process would have meant to have put Jesus' body into one of the cokes and to have sealed it. That's where we will stop our lesson. In our final lesson, we will focus on the resurrection. I hope you can join us.